The Katyn Massacre. The Soviet Union blamed the Nazis for their own massacre, and it worked for 50 years. Thousands of Polish military officers vanished into Soviet custody and were never seen again. When their mass graves were finally discovered, the Soviet Union immediately blamed Nazi Germany for the killings. Poland's own allies, desperate to maintain wartime unity with the Soviets, publicly accepted that explanation for decades, even though growing evidence pointed directly at Moscow the entire time. In September of 1939, following the Soviet Union's invasion of eastern Poland, conducted in coordination with Nazi Germany's simultaneous invasion from the west under the terms of their secret non-aggression pact, Soviet forces captured a genuinely substantial number of Polish military personnel, including a significant proportion of Poland's officer corps, professionals whose civilian careers in peacetime, including doctors, lawyers, teachers, and government officials, had led them to hold reserve military commissions, meaning Soviet forces had effectively captured a considerable portion of Poland's broader educated professional class alongside its actual career military officers. These captured Polish prisoners were held in several separate Soviet camps over the following months, and in the spring of 1940, on the direct formal authorization of Soviet leader Joseph Stalin and the broader Soviet Politburo, an estimated 22,000 Polish prisoners, encompassing military officers, police officials, and other captured Polish professionals, were systematically executed by Soviet secret police, the NKVD, at several separate locations, including a forest near the Russian village of Katyn, which would eventually lend its name to the broader massacre, despite representing only one of several actual execution sites involved. The Soviet Union maintained complete, sustained secrecy regarding these executions for the following several years, a secrecy that proved genuinely significant once Nazi Germany's own subsequent invasion of the Soviet Union in 1941 brought German forces into direct control of the specific region containing the Katyn Forest gravesite, and in 1943, German forces formally announced the discovery of the mass graves, immediately and publicly attributing the killings to Soviet responsibility, an accusation the Soviet Union immediately, formally denied, instead claiming the killings had actually been carried out by German forces themselves following their own 1941 invasion, directly inverting the actual historical responsibility for the massacre. This specific Soviet counter-accusation created a genuinely significant, difficult diplomatic problem for Poland's exiled wartime government and its Western Allied partners, since Poland's government, based in London following the country's occupation, possessed genuine mounting private concern regarding the fate of its missing officers and increasingly credible information suggesting actual Soviet responsibility, while simultaneously needing to maintain the Soviet Union's continued active military cooperation against Nazi Germany, a strategic necessity that placed genuine, direct pressure on Western Allied governments to avoid directly, publicly challenging the Soviet Union's official denial, regardless of whatever private doubts and evidence they may have actually possessed. The Soviet Union, following the war's conclusion, formally maintained its consistent denial of responsibility for decades, conducting its own formal investigation that predictably concluded German forces bore full responsibility, a conclusion the Soviet government maintained as official state policy throughout the following decades of communist rule, in both the Soviet Union and the broader Eastern Bloc, including Poland's own Soviet-aligned post-war government, which was required to formally maintain this same official Soviet explanation, despite widespread private knowledge and belief among ordinary Polish citizens that the massacre had actually been carried out by Soviet forces rather than German ones. Western intelligence agencies, including American and British services, had actually developed considerable independent evidence supporting genuine Soviet responsibility for the massacre during and shortly after the war itself. Evidence that, for the same broader strategic and diplomatic reasons that had constrained Poland's own exiled government during the war, remained largely unpublicized and formally unacknowledged by Western governments for decades following the war's conclusion, reflecting the broader Cold War-era diplomatic calculation that directly, publicly challenging the Soviet Union's official position on Katyn offered limited practical benefit while creating genuine additional diplomatic friction. This decades-long official Soviet denial finally formally ended in 1990 during the Soviet Union's own final years under Mikhail Gorbachev's considerably more transparent glasnost-era policies, when the Soviet government formally acknowledged genuine Soviet, rather than Nazi German, responsibility for the Katyn Massacre, a formal admission that Russia's subsequent post-Soviet government further substantiated in following years through the release of additional, formally classified Soviet documents directly confirming Stalin's own personal, direct authorization of the executions. What made this eventual formal acknowledgement genuinely historically significant extended beyond simply correcting the specific historical record regarding responsibility for the massacre itself. Since the decades-long Soviet denial, and the broader Western diplomatic reluctance to directly challenge that denial despite mounting contrary evidence, represented a genuinely significant, sustained example of how wartime and Cold War-era geopolitical necessity could directly suppress formal acknowledgement of a documented atrocity for decades, a suppression that only fully ended once the specific political circumstances that had originally motivated it had themselves fundamentally changed. What makes the Katyn Massacre endure as one of history's most significant examples of a state successfully redirecting blame for its own atrocity isn't simply the scale of the killings themselves, genuinely severe as that toll remains, but the specific, remarkable duration and effectiveness of the subsequent cover-up. A false explanation that Poland's own wartime allies felt compelled to publicly tolerate for strategic reasons, and that remained the official, enforced historical position across an entire communist bloc for nearly 50 years before political circumstances finally allowed the actual truth to be formally acknowledged. If stories like this, where a nation successfully blamed its own atrocity on someone else for nearly 50 years, and its own allies felt compelled to go along with it, are exactly what you come here for, subscribe to The Grave Details, because history holds more stories like this than most people will ever know.